Yes. Hooray. Can you hear me, Ken?
I've had, I confess, a somewhat chaotic morning, largely for methodological reasons. I've never been to this kind of occasion before. I do not know what a chatbox is and wonder how we were making such miracles with it. And I then looked to the questions that a few days ago you gave me to say you would approach. And I thought, how many book contracts are you offering me? In other words, I'm not very based. So if you wouldn't mind, I would like to kind of ease my tension and distract people by a little quotation from a writer. Already.
We're struggling a bit with your audio, Ken. Is it possible maybe to come a bit closer to the screen?
Closer to the screen. Yes, easily. How is that?
Try again. Yeah. You were just distorting a bit.
Speak.
So did you hear what I previously said?
Ask him if he can hear you.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can be heard. Have another go at your intro, please.
Oh, that's a wicked trick about take two. It's a bad one. What I want to say is that I had a rather discombobulated morning. I think that's what it is. In that I didn't understand what a chatbot was, couldn't understand how miraculously all these messages were appearing on screen, and my inherent, I won't say confusion, but dislocation continued. Now I'm in a better state, and I want to thank everyone for their contributions. But before you and I get together, may I be allowed to quote from a colleague?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. We rubbed along well enough, working together or alongside each other for some time, but we got on better when we didn't work together. He's intellectually bright, and I enjoyed that, but he's also eccentric and difficult, or rather, he and I found each other difficult. His mind is complex, political, and conspiratorial. He schemes and whispers in ears. If casting a Medici cardinal, he would be my first choice. But his achievements are substantial, and they've never been fully acknowledged. We won't put this into competition. This is Tony Garnett on myself. And I have a mixture of dislike and intensity of disapproval from that, and a very grudging feeling that he's got a little something in the middle right.
My feeling is that he got an awful lot of that right. The good bits as well as the bad bits.
Because I believe everything should be double. I also think there's a negative interpretation as well.
Well, I think we would all agree that your extraordinary contributions to television drama as a whole have not yet been sufficiently acknowledged. And it's very important to celebrate that your work from the mid-60s onwards. And this gathering is only a very tiny reflection and recognition of your work and the work of many other colleagues. It's a joy to talk to you again here. And I know that everybody who is joining this will be fascinated to get a sense of your ideas about what it was like working at the BBC in the 1970s as a producer. You'd worked at the BBC in the 60s as a script editor, you'd gone away to LWT in Granada, and then you came back in the early 70s. What was it like to work there then? What was the culture like?
Well, one of the questions is what is or was Play for today, and where is the best focus of attention for that? And one of the things that I found, again, forgive me for appearing to, as it were, disapprove or be critical of the morning's proceedings, I missed some things. And here is a few of the things I missed, and they're all cliches. The play's the thing, the life's the thing, the doubleness is everything. We're here now, say yes, have a good time. Now, I think we got no little sense of that because everyone was located quite rightly in their own professional area or locus of history. But that I envied, I have to say. Some of it I resented and found inappropriate. So I would like to say one other thing before we get down to the historical details of your 3-book contract to me. What crisis were we in during the era of Play for Today? And what drama, and this is a quotation from Radio 4 Today, we're entering a period of deprivation, unemployment, where women can't feed their children and even may turn to prostitution to do so. That's a little capsule of the world we're in today on this moment of grace on the Thursday in November 2020. And it does seem to me that we've lost any sense of that focus in our discussions at the moment, but that when Play for Today in period was there, it wasn't available in some golden age way. We need to examine that, but it was preoccupied with its job, not all the digressions. That was that bit. So
what do you? Okay, so what do you think that job was of Play for Today? What was the absolutely central focus that you and other producers were trying to achieve 40 years ago in making television drama?
Well, there's a sense I don't want to be recklessly egotistic, but my focus and my practice was not necessarily what other producers did. I mean, I quoted from Tony, and there was the example of his focus and his slight disfocus for me. But the common thing I think we had, Tony and I, and as he says there, we didn't work together for that long, was, there's only one word, obsession. And with what was the obsession? And I feel that my obsession was somehow to create out of an environment for which I wasn't trained, not at all. I spent 3 years as an academic before responding to Roger Smith's invitation to come in. And I walked through the front door, or rather I walked through the back door and went forward. And within a year, I'd been given a series as a script editor, and we moved on. And we then moved on again because Tony and I did, of course, resume a collaboration with an organization called Kestrel Productions, which turned out to be the very first, although it was brief and rather abortive, expression of independence among creators, not independence among actors or managers, but people who were at it. And Tony had the advantage of having been an actor, so he knew his business in a way. I didn't feel I even had that advantage. So I just occupied the space, felt my way around, and somehow something came good. Now that's a terrible confession in a way, but I think if you ask me another day, I might be much more pompous about it. I think it was a little bit like that. And where did we get? And how quickly did we get there? Or did I get there?
And
I mean, I'm giving you the chance to come back and be orthodox about it if you want to.
No, I don't. I've got little interest in being orthodox, but I have got an interest in understanding how you worked with others to further that obsession, and particularly with writers. I mean, talk to us a bit about the way in which you worked with writers, the way you worked with Dennis Potter, but a very distinguished other roster of writers who you return to again and again to support.
Yes, okay, but I think, and it's tempting for me to expatiate and digress here, and you must stop me. There were two kinds of writers, two genres of writers with whom I worked, experimented, and succeeded or failed. And one category was Dennis Potter, who was something in his own right, a man operating entirely inside his own head. And he and I had the good luck or misfortune to meet even before we were each lucky enough to go to Oxford. And quite early on in that association, Dennis was quite clearly in control of the Oxford game and the game of the future. But there was one little contribution I made, which I didn't recognize the importance of until a few years later. And that was a weird article in ISIS, the Oxford magazine, which I think still persists. And it was called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. And it had a profile, a parody profile of a crooner singing and smoking at the same time. And the proposition of this article was, there's more to this rubbish than you think. It's not just rubbish. And 10 years later, or more than 10 years later, Dennis and I emerged very unequally. I say emerging because he had that creative talent and I didn't as such. We emerged with something called Pennies from Heaven. So that was a syndrome which in different ways continued right the way through Dennis's life and ended on his death night when I was in Ireland making a movie with me picking up the phone to the press who were pursuing me. And they said, what was it like? And I said, it was like a marriage that never quite worked and never quite failed. Now, nothing else in my relation with writers was like that. So the other category, also a category that began early, was much more of the beginner, me, trying to coach other beginnings. And in an extremely inhospitable environment, because the series I was asked to script edit technically, but in practice produce, because we didn't see the producer very often, not only wanted new writers and was 30 minutes, which is the opposite from being an easy discipline. The other peril, which I loathed, and had been trained by people like Tony and Ken Loach in that first year to loathe, it was live. You had to do it in 27 minutes. And I mean, I'm not talking about the order of events with these writers, which came first, the discoveries. But one of the important discoveries was when, desperately looking around for a piece for a fortnight's time to put on the air, I came upon a collection of stories called Winter's Tales, which contained a tale which isn't like one of those Euripidean 8 basic things, but it nearly is. The story of a medical practitioner whose credentials are stolen. That was the proposition. The doctor holds himself up and his brother has to get himself out. And I was about to find a hack to adapt it when the writer of the original stories rang me up and said, I could have a go at that. And his name was Simon Gray. And we moved on from there. And the movement on from there was characterized in the one instance, Simon wrote one of these things by panic. And the panic was that I was doing the duty of, the Taro producer, leading the Taro round, the Taro author around to meet the cast and say good luck 15 minutes before they went on the air. And one of them we couldn't find. And his name was John Le Mesurier, and his dressing room was empty. And we panicked. But fortunately, John turned up, kind of sober and brilliant. But of course, the piece was lost forever. So that was one example. And there were other examples in that year where writers of some substance emerged out of the mist. But having decided that I give you Simon's example, it's probably time to move on to something else.
Well, I'm very curious how, as a producer, you saw what you were doing with writers. Were you simply facilitating their vision, or were you involved in that creative process in quite a deep way?
I think I was doing both, depending on who we were dealing with. And I think, oddly enough, with Dennis, though it took years and years for me to admit it, I was least as much, or nearly as least as much, if that's a sensible phrase, facilitating the vision as otherwise, because I don't think he had a real sense of form or ambition. He was just crazy to write, and been writing, as far as I could gather, since he was about 4.5. And there it was to channel the instinct and channel the desire into a shape which was compatible with the state of television. I remember the television, I hate to say these things because it makes me feel too veteran. Television 50 years ago was in a quite raw, innocent state, particularly dramatically. Yeah. There were only 2 channels, and only 2 channels for several years. And no one really had been given the remit to say, if you give me some money, I will come back with something. And that essentially, I think, was the position that I was put in. And one of the other writers I created, not created, wrong word, encouraged in 30-minute theatre was somebody who didn't go through. And this was a man called Raymond Williams, who was at that period the most serious and cultured and cultivated and followed cultural critic of his time. And Raymond and I made, first, I think one was a play for today, or it might have been a Wednesday play, a full-length piece about a desperate old signalman in the railway in Wales. And the other piece, which was 30 minutes, was called A Message from the Country. Now, 30-minute theatre had the tiniest studio the BBC ever had, and very little resources. And so therefore, you felt deprived. Did you? No, you didn't, because directors were determined to make it the most ambitious piece in history. And I learned a lesson on what Raymond's piece, which was about the collision, still very, very current and relevant, between a newly elected Labour MP and his more extreme followers in the country. And they come up to London and meet him and don't get anywhere. They all have to say goodbye to each other and hope to do better another day. And the final scene was set on Paddington Station, platform 1, which some people will know. And it was the train moving up the station, up the platform, being followed by the cast members. And we did it. And the next morning, I was called into the head of department's office, and he said, Ken, don't apologize. Don't apologize. I saw it. I saw camera collide with camera. But my great relief was, at least they said BBC and not ITV. So there was a kind of spirit of forgiveness, of absurdity and incompetence around, which taught me that we were in pioneer country. And there was a sense in which if you had the nerve, and if you were instinctively anti-institutional, which I think I am, you could do a lot. You could light a fire, and if it didn't burn the building down, they'd let you light another one. That was creatively the position I was in. And I don't think it ever got more satisfying or more complacent until 40 years later. It was still experimental. It was still not conventional. It was still alive and therefore dangerous. And at least that was better than being complacent and pro forma.
Those are genuinely wonderful words, which I think we need to hold on to as inspirations now, but also to recognize what was driving a lot of your work and the work of others, some others, in that pioneering moment. We've talked quite a bit this morning already about the studio versus film, and you obviously began essentially in a studio world, but you were then later very strongly associated with the push towards filming television drama. What are your thoughts about the differences now, the possibilities and the problems of the studio, and the reasons why you wanted later to work so strongly on film?
Yes, very good. But let me first of all say the genesis of that, which is slightly unexpected. As I said earlier, in my second year only of being in the business and never having had the ambition until Roger Smith made his miracle or disastrous call, come in, I didn't think about, shall we say, theatre or activation in any form. But I came in and was working very, very intensely, extremely intensely with Tony and then Ken, and with an atmosphere which was saying to itself, we must get out of this dump, which was the glories of Television Centre, and go into the streets and make films. And so I was infected by that ideology. Oddly enough, I'm realizing this for the first time in my life, much more strongly than I was affected by the other ideology, which was there as an ideology, which was we must all be lefties. And it now looks, John, as if you've fallen asleep, but it can't be. It must be just a distortion on my screen.
I think it's just your screen.
And it was.
I'm not.
You're back.
I haven't fallen asleep. I promise you, Ken.
So what I developed during that year, partly fostered by the experience with Simon Gray and John Le Mesurier, because you wanted that never to happen again, was that there was something uncontagious and dangerous in the toxic way with the theatre form, because television drama had clearly taken as its role model, culturally and in terms of genre, the theatre, not the cinema. And when I walked into Television Centre for the first time, and it's hard to believe, and I may be eliding two things, but let's do so because you have to simplify. This was a day, it was both my first day, and it was also the day that Dennis Potter's Vote for Nigel Barton was taken off the air. And so I immediately, because I was the only person who knew him, had a role. And that day was, what's the phrase, was a momentous day for me, because I learned something very fundamental, particularly from Sidney Newman, the legendary head of drama, who closeted 4 people, Dennis Potter, myself, Tony Garnett, and Roger Smith, in his office while we were seething with the play having been banned, tried to get us drunk, but most of us didn't drink. And after Dennis had departed, lectured us as what we could expect in our duty, assumed to be lifetime, of being members of the BBC. And as we left his capacious office, obscenely capacious office, he called us back and said, just one more thing, fellas. And Sidney spent the day trying to turn our indignation into belief in him, and that we would get that play back, and we would have a wonderfully radical environment for the rest of our lives. And as he said, one more thing, little heads popped back the door, and he said, one more thing. Yes, Sidney, whatever you do, don't trust me. And that was a profound lesson in, I suppose it has to be called the dialectic, and it's never left me. And it's the only, I think, canon of belief in fundamental systems, a negative one, which has replaced my fundamental principle of upbringing. But I'm now turning that day into an even bigger one, because I believe now I can say it was the first day I was in the BBC bar, the BBC Club Bar Television Centre, which was quite new, and it was buzzing with all the afflatus and self-satisfaction and worry of being in the industry. And we were there absolutely isolated, because everybody else was stagey and lovey and sort of indifferent to the world outside, as you can imagine. And I think I coined, or it might have been Tony, it was more likely to have been me, that the characterization of that culture is saying they're all behaving as if they were born with silver prompt spoons in their mouth. Now, there's no such thing as a silver prompt spoon, but it was a way of symbolizing the theatricality, which was their world. And there we were, embattled in a different cause. And that was not politics for me, it was film. And so when I went to the year after the 30-Minute Theatre, as that series was called, it was a desire to be in that alternative ideology. And I'm sure people are saying, well, wasn't anything to do with the form, but of course it was as well, because I found, and I think what Richard Eyre was saying earlier, very, very wise and useful, but the differences technologically and creatively, and in terms of how you breathe even, between being in one of those big studios and being outside, wherever it is, whether it's a country house or a kind of a slum, doing it differently in terms of reality. So that explains a little bit of that, I think.
And where did your belief and enthusiasm for film come from? I mean, were you watching the British New Wave cinema or French cinema or Bergman or why film?
Why film? Because, well, one of the things was because it wasn't television. I mean, there's a sense in which we were, or I particularly were ungrateful recipients of bounty, because there was a lot of resource in television and budgets were not that pressed, but it was nevertheless within a straitjacket. And it was also within a straitjacket, which was, in my view, inimical to easy. When I say easy, I don't mean without effort. It wasn't compatible, in my view, with the creative instinct. Now, I modified that view later, but I can tell you without going to too much of a alternative anecdote, what made me feel hostile to studio. And it was, again, a very early day. I can't pretend it was still that same Wednesday, but it was very much later. When I went into the gallery of a television studio, drama gallery, for the first time, and this is going to sound so naive, I sat on the edge of the row of seats, which was in front of the bank of cameras, and started to watch. And the first thing was, I was turned out of that seat because it belonged to the designer, who had to be mobile enough to come up and down and look there and then go onto the floor. And I then looked down onto the floor as the designer emerged from a long staircase and saw him approach the director and the actors. And I looked back at the screen and I was mesmerized by the contrast between that image and that bit of tatty working industrial reality downstairs. It was something like that. And there was also, in the ingredient of the studio operation, I won't go into stories here because it would take us forever, I don't have to name names, there was a spirit of militaristic or pseudo-militaristic relationship between the bosses upstairs, particularly the director, I'm not talking about management, that's to say civilized man, and the workers downstairs. There was bullying. And also, and this I will be specific about, there was a director who became a great friend later and left us only 2 years ago, so I'm still a bit reluctant to mention his name, who intimidated on that floor an actress called, I won't mention her, why am I being so dark, but I keep it that way, so that she could not return after lunch. I mean, she was so terrified of being told she'd made a little slip, in making a move, and all the men waiting for their lunch, so the women. So I found there that there was a sense of you were much better dealing with people if you were equal, at least at ground level. And all that, I'm sure, sounds very arty or very non-arty about, say, the difference between film and television, but it was. The other thing, quickly, in that era, and this happened shortly before both Tony and I left, I think shortly before we were engulfed in this process called production called Kestrel Productions, where Tony was already preparing Kes for another branch of the company. I was looking after the television operation, and I found myself producing, in a very hack-handed way, a film by one Jean-Luc Godard. But the film that we produced, or I was having to look at, was nothing to do with Godard's main reputation. It was called British Sounds, not British Imagery, and it was to do with his obsession with being in the streets, being anti-cinematic, and just being part of a revolution. It was bogus in the sense that it didn't last long, pieces worth seeing, but I was infected by all that. And I'm resisting, I realized, talking about the aesthetic of film, which is very, very important as a comparison, because that would take more time than I feel we've got.
I think that's fascinating. Do you think that filmmaking, the process of filmmaking, was more democratic, more egalitarian? I mean, you talked about the different levels of the boss and the workers. Was that not the case when you went away from Television Centre and were in a field?
No, that's one of the illusions. I don't think that in a fully professional sense, film can be anything but autocratic. Although we all went through a stage, which something which probably not Tony, but somebody else initiated, where on a real film, whether it was for television or the cinema, you had a list at the end of the real credits and you said, this film was also made by, and you simply listed it without attributing all the people who've done all the things that you, as a boss person, couldn't do. So there was that was kind of appeasing a kind of guilt about it. But the reality, and certainly I would say this because I know Ken Loach very well, but we've actually worked about, Ken makes those films in that sense. He does not, even though the mythology about his work is that he's very democratic, and I think he is with actors. Nevertheless, the people who are operating down below, around him, are fulfilling his vision of what's in his head. Ken would be appalled at me saying this, but it's something, again, here I am sitting talking to you, and all kinds of professional things are coming out there, which I wouldn't say if I was just having lunch with Ken Loach. But I think there is a sense of that. So film at its best is nearly always autocratic. There are examples of, clearly, both in Hollywood and Britain, of nasty directors, but that doesn't say anything about their talent, nor of extremely nice people does it say they're going to win Oscars. But there is a connection between the way you operate, the work rate, and indeed your attitude to society, which is fostered by the fact that even up till now, it seems to me there isn't a way, and again, I just take in all the changes we're seeing around us. One of them reflected in a session to come this afternoon, I suspect, of there must be kind of gender equality and so on. And finally, I would say, and this is a really perverse piece of self-masturbation, I'm still trying to make films. Film I'm trying to make at the moment, and for Hollywood, although we may decide it has to be for Britain, is a film which challenges all those shibboleths. It's a film set in the world of Playboy, Hugh Hefner, and all that disgusting stuff. And that the heroine of the film is a woman who thrived during that era, but is and was still living, and it is non-feminist. So if anyone wants to look at that script, there's an invitation. I don't think we'll ever get it made. And Me Too, which you don't hear much about anymore, has made that more unlikely. So, but the issue is still there. And I'll just say one more thing about that area, which refers to the earlier period, that when we did a panel for the BFI recently, you and I were on it, there was a discussion about the portrayal of rape on television. And unfortunately, during that discussion, what's nearly happened now is that I got cut out of it because of a Zoom problem, so I didn't join in. And when we came back, it was too late for me to say that in it was probably 73, 74, and still early in my producing career, I was invited as a guest on a series called Hypothetical. And the Hypothetical was a series of documentaries, now since completely forgotten, a format of documentaries coming, I believe, from the Ford Foundation, which took a legal or moral dilemma and you discussed it for hours, and it was then boiled down to 50 minutes. And mine, well, I say mine, I've got other producers and directors, including Alan Clark, on the panel. The prospect was, if a writer came to you, presumably a woman writer with a play about rape, would you want to do it and could you get it on? And the consensus was that we could, but I never did. Despite there being among the production team from Granada who made the series, a writer anxious to write a play about rape. And that's so important was this format at the time that there is still, I think somewhere in my outhouse, a book called The Limits of Freedom, still a good title, which has a verbatim account of that event. So things were taken seriously, but they didn't actually, how should we say, function or activate until very much later, despite the fact, I'm sorry, I must just say this, the first two writers I ever commissioned were female, Julia Jones and Emily Lethbridge, who is still, I think, alive. And I continued to do that whenever I could, but not for its own sake. The work was the thing, the content was the thing, and gender was not irrelevant, but actually not in the forefront. It couldn't be.
So let me just, we need to draw to a close in a moment, but I want to go back pre the gender discussion to the autocracy question, to the who's in charge and the relationship between the director and the writer. Because you, as we've said, you work with major writers, you work with a number of major directors as well. Who is, on a film, who is determining that film? Is it Roland Joffe or is it Jim Allen? Who, you know,
you're walking into a small obsessive trap, which I didn't want to bring up. My belief is that, or what I conceived in my head after working for quite a long time, is that this again makes irrelevant the previous discussion about the distinction between crew and what they call above the line. My belief is that a film should be made by three people, made in the responsible sense and the creative sense collectively, or three functionaries, and that is writer, director, and producer. And preferably they should be three people and not one or two. And that collaboration, which is at creative, financial, and all other levels, takes place. Now, there are some writers who are very, very interested in that aspect of the producer level, and some who don't even know it's there. I mean, Simon Gray, you couldn't even get to come to a screening of his own work, and had no interest in that side of it. Dennis got obsessed with it, and it didn't work for him, but it was there. But the point I make, and this is where you walked into a trap, I noticed that in the aftermath of your program this week on BBC4, which I think is going to become a landmark legend, I would say that, there is something which I find profoundly, well, quite painful, that whenever you have a clip of a film, you have a display which has the title of the film and two names, not three. It says director, it says writer, it does not say producer. And yet some of us, including me, spent years persuading the organizations like BAFTA and the BFI, who we failed with because the BFI is still derelict about it, saying there is that indispensable trio formally, even though in each case it may vary. So why are producers being put into outer darkness again? That's the trap.
I take the criticism. I hope that the film nonetheless recognized the creative contribution of producers in a very serious way.
Why does it have to be anonymous?
Well, perhaps it's something to take off subject. Okay, I've got one last question, but I'm very happy to come back to that discussion. You know, between you and I, ideally over a glass of decent wine.
You can never have that again for the rest of our lives because of Cody.
Well, I know we'll get back there. Okay, I'm going to ask you to name the three works that you are most proud of having produced. It can be out of play for today, or it can be from the whole of your, immensely distinguished career. Give us
Well, yes,
three things. Go on. Three things that you feel you should be remembered by.
Well, again, I'm going to be a little bit indirect and say that many friends, but it doesn't include myself or you, I think, so far, but it will, when asked to produce a list of desert island discs, have a different age depending on what day they're asked. But the principle of something close to your heart remains, whatever the choice. And so this day, because I was thinking about it, I'm going to mention 3 pieces, none of which happen to be BBC, but all happen to have one thing in common, which is a great virtue in our industry, if we can do it. They're very good and they're short. And so there is a piece by, which one shall I do first? There's a piece by Julia Jones called Faith and Henry, which we made as part of the orchestral productions thing with London Weekend, and directed very well by Jack Gold. And it's a 2-hander, and there is a girl adolescent and a boy adolescent trying, as it were, to get their affections together by walking home every day along the canal path, a canal path in Lancashire. And I'm tempted to say no more about it because it's spoiled if you do. Yeah. And that's only 50 minutes, but it works like a dream, and it sums up and does for a testimony to all kinds of other dilemmas and preoccupations we have. The second one happens to be a Dennis Potter, which is also a brief one, and that's called Paper Roses. And Paper Roses we made with Granada. And it's, for me, in a way, the most glorious of the 3 for personal reasons. That I have, this might have been a quite sort of sharp and acidulous attitude to institutions. And what Paper Roses does, which Dennis promised would be a denunciation of tabloid journalists, is actually something much more than that, and takes you through the process of a professional life in a day of people working at The Guardian years and years ago, but somehow manages to take in its stride brilliantly both the emotional pain of many of those characters, but also has a rejectorial, in a kind of humorous way, mission towards its subject. I put that when it comes there. But I'll just tell you that when Dennis delivered that play to me in the street somewhere in London, I'd read it and I said, denounce him. I said, you promised me you would be a denunciation of tabloid journalists, and what I've got is a story about an old boy who falls down a lift. And he said, it's there in both form. So that is brilliant. The third one is the third one is a Colin Welland. Say? Yeah. The third one is a Colin Welland, which we made at Granada when we were trying to make Leeds United, and Granada Television, for reasons which will follow us all to the grave, didn't want to do it. We took it to the BBC, and a piece of tempestuous history follows, and incidentally, Leeds United lives. You must honour that life and the life and career of Roy Battersby. It must be seen, it must be valued. Anyway, this piece is called Roll On 4 O'Clock, and it's about 50 minutes, and it's a kind of comedy, much of it having the sort of feeling of a kid's story, but it's not. Set in the secondary modern school, very grim, across a few days. And again, I won't describe the whole plot, but to say that it manages to state the passion for oppressed people, in this case kids, and to provide an enormous number of laughs. And it became completely unintentionally a gay icon of a lot of people 10 years ago. And that piece, I think, is probably my favorite of those 3, because it does it with such economy, but also such energy and such passion that I would say that was a 3. Now, if you'd asked me this question on another day, I probably wouldn't mention any of these, but it's good perhaps to honour something untypical rather than something typical and difficult.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of those three can be denigrated. Yeah.
I think that's fascinating. And I think it's one of the things we hoped would come out of today and out of these discussions, which is to bring back into awareness work of the highest quality, which for whatever reason has been largely forgotten. It is too easy for us as students of this work, but also for people who schedule repeat series to return to Abigail's Party or whatever over and over. And it's so important to recognize and celebrate work of the highest quality, beyond that canon.
Yeah, other people's time, but I should do it because it's relevant. If what you mean, and this has been said a lot about Play for Today, and in the course of this process, that there are too many to watch. Something happened even here this morning to me, where I suppose one of the, I don't really spend much time thinking about this. You think about the best, you don't always want to think about the worst, if that's the only alternative to the best. And I suppose in my head, if you said to me, what are the three weakest of Plays for Today I used, I wouldn't tell you now. There were four, but your colleague John Hill liberated one of them for my reattention a month ago, and that's a piece called Taking Leave. I really recommend that. We need to say why. And of the other three who were still on the list of iffy, I came into the room and I think Simon Farquhar was mentioning this piece and extolling its virtues. So I give you Housewife's Choice, which I was ashamed of, and God knows why, because clearly somebody thinks there's merit there. And that must apply to all the 280 and all the other 20 or 30 we'll never see again.
Yeah.
There's life there, there was care there, and there was somebody's embodiment of their self-expression in that form at that time.
I think that's a very, very wise and even rather moving tribute to all of that work made in complex and demanding circumstances, which from which we can take so much now. Ken, thank you so much. I think everybody watching, our 63 participants, have recognized the passion and the intelligence and the occasional eccentricity of you as a person and you as a producer. And it's been a thrill to experience that and to exchange a few words about it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, John, because I was scared of this morning, really scared. You asked me to do it at 9:40, and I said, no, I've got a big thing on last night. And Richard Eyre stepped in, and Richard, I think, did superbly to setting out the kind of territory in a way I couldn't possibly have done. But the final thing would be to recommend the only piece I think that Richard and I worked on at the BBC when he was producing and directing and I was producing. And this is a piece actually made for BBC Two, and it's called Past Caring. And it stars Denham Elliott and a lot of other people whose names don't come to me. And it is, if you want non-PC, have a look at Past Caring. But again, I think it's gorgeously passionate and worth seeing, but I don't think we ever will. The main part was offered originally to John Gielgud when he must have been not quite in his 90s, but pushing on. And the message came back. I did work with him briefly as a script editor at one point. The message came back. So John wanted to convey the message. It wasn't quite the sort of material he was looking up for at this time. But Denham had a ball. So Past Caring.
Very good. All right. Thank you for those great recommendations. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas. And I hope you'll stay with us for some of the afternoon as well.
I will.
What